Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope you've all had a good couple of weeks. A big thank you to all of you who've been listening and supporting the series, and a shout out to all the lovely patrons over on Patreon, including the latest subscriber, Jeff. So thanks everyone for your support. I really appreciate that, and it really does help. I also have to say thanks to those of you who've been in touch recently to say how much you're enjoying the series. Thank you for taking the time to reach out and for all your lovely messages. It's so nice to hear that, and it means a lot that you guys are enjoying the podcast, so thank you. To those of you who've also dropped me a line with requests for future episode topics, thanks for sending those in. I've added those to my list, so I'll make sure there are future episodes exploring those subjects. If you have an idea for a topic from local folklore or local history that comes from your area of Devon or Cornwall, then feel free to drop me a line at thepiskytrap@gmail.com. In other news, if you're based in Devon and you're interested in the topic of witchcraft, folklore and local history, then you can catch me at the Exeter Phoenix on the 3rd of July, where I'll be giving a talk exploring some of the history of witchcraft in Devon. If you missed my talk last year on Cornish witchcraft, there's another chance to catch that if you're here in Cornwall or visiting Cornwall this summer. On the 12th of July, I'll be taking the talk to Loswithiel in the community centre there, and on the 8th of August, I'll be at the Polly in Falmouth. You can find links to where you can get tickets for all these events in the show notes below. Right, that's quite enough of my ramblings. Let's get straight on with the episode. We've spent quite a bit of time over the series so far looking into local beliefs and traditions from across Cornwall. But I'm always fascinated by the crossover of beliefs and ideas on either side of the River Tamar. The similarities and the differences between folklore that you find in Devon and the folklore here in Cornwall. Back in early May, Elizabeth Dale and myself gave a talk over at Port Eliot as part of their Mystery and History Conference. And whilst we were there, I had the chance to listen to a brilliant talk given by Dr Sharon Gedye that explored the folklore of pixies in West Devon and drew from the work of Anna Eliza Bray. It was a fascinating talk that I found really enlightening because I'd encountered Bray's work in the past, but hadn't looked into it in much detail. And a lot of the stories and traditions surrounding pixie beliefs from this area around Dartmoor, Tavistock, the River Tavy and the Tamar really stood out to me. And instantly I knew it was something I wanted to delve into and explore further. I was also fascinated by Bray herself, this 19th century writer based in Tavistock, and I wanted to know more about her. So after the talk, I spoke briefly with Sharon, and a couple of weeks later we sat down to have a Zoom chat. So in this episode, you're going to be hearing from our discussion about the work of Anna Bray, as we explore some of the different stories that she collected, the themes, as well as some of the old local traditions and customs that she recorded from this part of West Devon. Without any further ado then, here's our next episode, Anna Eliza Bray. In Devonshire, and more especially on Dartmoor, it is a very common thing with any person who loses his way to consider himself as pixie-led. And this frequently happens to our stout yeomen and farmers when they happen to have a cup too many at a merrymaking. But for this there is a remedy. For whoever finds himself, or if a woman herself, pixie-led, has nothing more to do than turn jacket, petticoat, pocket, or apron inside out. And a pixie, who hates the sight of any impropriety in dress, cannot stand this, and off the imp goes, as if, according to the vulgar saying, he had been sent packing with a flea in his ear. A quote there from Anna Eliza Bray's Traditions, Legends, Superstitions and Sketches of Devonshire on the Borders of the Tamar and the Tavy, first published in 1836. The work takes the form of a series of letters to the poet Robert Southey. And in there we find a mixture of writings on the local landscape, history, wildlife, but also a fascinating look at local traditions, customs and stories, what we would now call folklore. And in that quote I just read, we get an example of the local belief from Dartmoor that people can become pixie-led. An idea we've explored in the podcast before in relation to local Cornish tales, where we hear of people becoming lost or led astray by the piskies. And the title of this podcast is kind of linked with that idea. I was always keen to look at other examples from this area of West Devon, not that far from the Tamar and the border with Cornwall, to see how much of a crossover there might have been with local beliefs and traditions. And it seems that Bray's work might be able to offer some insight. And it also stands out because this is pretty early on in terms of this kind of work. Often in this series you'll hear me mention the likes of writers like William Bottrell, Robert Hunt, Margaret Ann Courtney, sometimes Sabine Baring-Gould and others, and a majority of them are writing much later, from around the mid-1860s onwards. But here we have an example of a female writer who's writing and researching and bringing together this work in the 1830s, which is amazing, really. There had been people going around Devon and Cornwall and researching before this time. For example, Richard Carew, William Borlase, who was mentioned in the last episode, and Robert Heath, writing in the mid-1700s. And a bit later, Fortescue Hitchens and Samuel Drew publish A History of Cornwall in 1824. But you often find that they tend to be focused on natural history, the landscape and science. You get occasional mentions of things in local folklore, which are tantalizing, but offer no real insight. They're almost mentioned in passing. It might be that they're going through a site in the landscape and they'll simply put something like, "The local people say the fairies and little people used to dance here." Or they might mention the idea of becoming pisky or pixie-led. Or, "We don't go near that bridge at night because it's said to be haunted." But there's no real drive to look into any of these stories or traditions further. That's where Anna Bray's work differs. And she must have been among the first people to start looking into these local traditions in more detail. So, what do we know about her? She seems to have been born in Newington in what was then Surrey, but is now part of the borough of Southwark in South London, in 1790. In 1818 she marries Charles Alfred Stothard, who was an antiquarian who seems to have focused on illustrations of monuments and sculptures. But tragically, he died in 1821 after falling from a ladder whilst tracing a portrait from one of the windows in St Andrew's Church at Beer Ferrers in West Devon. A couple of years later, she marries Edward Atkins Bray, vicar of Tavistock, and she begins writing novels alongside other works, including the one that we've mentioned on the Tamar and the Tavy, as well as a book for younger readers called A Peep at the Pixies, or Legends of the West, published in 1854. I wanted to know more about Anna Bray's work and some of the stories and local folklore she collected. And so recently I sat down to chat with Dr Sharon Gedye, a landscape writer and researcher who has a fantastic blog called A Walk in English Weather, looking at the landscape and local history from around Dartmoor, which I highly recommend. We actually began by talking about the landscape and how place names evolve and can be impacted or influenced by writers and folklorists like Bray.
That leads me into talking about Bray and her pixies, which is what we're going to be mainly talking about, because in looking at what she's written, there's a couple of places that she talks about where I think it's her own influence that have caused the place name to get the name Pixie, where it didn't exist before. So there's a place north of Tavistock near at Kilworthy House where there's a place called Pixie's Pool. And actually, when I've gone back to look at her writing, she describes the place as being beautiful and this pool overhung by trees, and that it's so hung with aged trees, their roots starting from the banks and overshadowing with their green arms the rippling waters. That is the very scene in which one would fancy the pixies and fays make their haunts. So she's very poetic about it. But then she goes on to say that this place has, since I endeavoured to describe a scene suggested by it, received the name of the Pixies Pool. So she's responsible for it getting that name. And then it goes on to appear on the Ordnance Survey first edition and second edition maps as Pixies Pool. But it had nothing to do with pixies. It was just her as a landscape writer describing it, and it ends up on the OS map. And there was no pixie legend there at all in the first place. So
I love things like that. It's like when I was doing research for a talk late last year, and it was about ghosts in the Cornish landscape. There's a place that's most people know it now as St Nectan's Glen or St Nectan's Keeve, but a brilliant writer called Alex Langstone, he wrote a book called From Granite to Sea. He talks about, it appears in the 18th century on the maps as Nathan's Cave.
Okay.
And then you get sort of the likes of Robert Hawker and people in the sort of mid 19th century, and suddenly the name changes on the maps to St Nectan's Keeve or St Nectan's Glen as it later becomes. So it's weird how folklore and the influence that these sort of Victorian antiquarians, if you like, have, and how that becomes it becomes a sort of fact, because it's sort of, once it appears in map form, you kind of take it for granted, don't you?
Yeah, anything that once it's in print of any form gets a different level of acceptance, doesn't it? And I think we always have to remember that when we're looking at these sources, constantly contextualize and critiquing what we see, because there's often more to it, isn't there? Yeah, I mean, I don't go as far as dismissing everything. I've got some friends who are, I know it's important to be critical, but yeah, we need to critique it and hold the possibilities that it could or could not be true at the same time. Yeah,
I think it's one thing to look at the evolution of things without being dismissive at the same time either, because I think even if folklore doesn't always have its roots as far back as we think it might, that's equally interesting in terms of how folklore evolves and things like that.
Yeah, and also in looking at the folklore, you pick up things about their own beliefs. They're talking about other people's beliefs, but you get instances of their beliefs as well. So I can so there's an interesting thing that Bray says about pixies, which betrays her own beliefs as well. So she talks about, she says, It is reported that in days of yore, as well as in the present, the wild waste of Dartmoor was much haunted by spirits and pixies in every direction, and these frequently left their own especial domain to exercise their mischievous propensities and gambols, even in the town of Tavistock itself, though it was then guarded by its stately abbey, well stocked with monks who made their war on the pixie race with bell, book, and candle. But of late years, the good people here affirm that by means of the clergy being more learned than formerly, and the burial service being so much enlarged to what it was in other days, the spirits are more closely bound to keep the peace, and the pixies are held tolerably fast and conjured away to their own domains. And so that is showing us Bray's belief, because she was an Anglican, and from what I understand from other historians, she was quite anti-Catholic, and so she's really reflecting her own anti-Catholic sentiments there, saying that the Catholic monks did a tolerably good job of keeping the pixies at bay, but the more learned clergy now and the better burial service mean that they are much more effectively kept in check. And whether it's just her own views or a more general anti-Catholic sentiment of the early 19th century, but so we're seeing pixie belief there, but we're also seeing the belief of the person that's writing it and the society that they're in, weaving into the pixie folklore itself. So I think that's a really nice example.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because, funnily enough, it feeds into something that will the latest episode, which will come out tomorrow, in fact, we kind of look at, it's on a very different topic, but it's about sort of healthcare in Cornwall in the 18th century. But there's a chap called Robert Heath, and he was writing about life on the Isles of Scilly back in the mid 18th century. But he talks about how there were once fairies and piskies and ghosts and things on the Isles of Scilly, but they were conjured and charmed out of the Isles of Scilly by knowing men from the mainland who came over, and ever since they've disappeared.
Okay, so the same thing.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
really fascinating, and I think maybe it hints at, it gives you a little insight into beliefs at the time. But obviously, Bray's coming at from the perspective of she's married to a reverend, right?
Yeah, she's married to the Anglican vicar.
So yeah, I think again, I think it provides a fascinating insight into, and you get this along the way. I think the nature of the way that the work is constructed, that the Tamer on the Tavy, I mean, is because it's in the form of these letters, you get little insights into her thoughts and sort of speculating on things, and the Druids crop up all the time.
Yeah.
And that sort of gives you a little insight into people's theories that people were having.
So I Bray talks a lot about Druids, but everyone writing back then about the antiquities were talking about Druids, and I get a little bit defensive about Bray because in more in the last kind of, well, probably for a very long time, but I know more recent histories around Tavistock can often be a little bit denigrating of her for talking about folklore and for also talking about Druids. But we have to remember she was writing in the 1830s. Folklore wasn't yet a discipline, and conveying the beliefs of other people doesn't mean you believe in them yourself, and that that folklore itself is something ridiculous and makes you as the writer a ridiculous writer. I get a sense that is how she's viewed sometimes, but also the writing about the Druids, she's denigrated for writing about that, but everyone that was the paradigm at the time. Archaeology didn't exist as a discipline at that point, so she's doing as best she can within the paradigm that she's in, and I don't think we should be ridiculing her for expressing those things. So I quite a champion of what she was doing back then, because she was innovative. She did move things on. She was doing stuff that was different to some of the other writers of the day. So good for her.
I think I see it as an evolution. You can see the evolution of thought that's happening at that time in this sort of, what you could see as a kind of early days of sort of before it's even termed folklore, really. I think that really comes in this sort of, is it the mid 90s, etc., around this sort of time, the terms
Yeah,
come.
my understanding that folklore is not a phrase that's been coined when she's writing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see how they're drawing conclusions from the facts they have, the stories that are told locally. I think that's why, although I was aware of Bray's work, it was only fairly recently I started tapping into it more, and you see so many correlations with stories from other places, but also that feed into, or you can see how this was influenced. I like the fact that she references every now and again. You hear about, I got this from such and such a farmer, or she even passes along things. You get the sense that she's been told some of these stories from her second husband, who is from Tavistock, if I remember rightly.
That's right. Yeah, the Reverend Edward Atkins Bray. Yes, so she gets some stories from him. She's really interesting in that she is one of the first people to gather folklore and not kind of just talk about it generically. So lots of the pixie folklore that I was looking at that came before her were little brief mentions and talking about general characteristics of what pixies do, like leading people astray. But she's the first one to really foreground the method that she's using to get the stories and to quote the words that people have been using to her and to her servant Mary Colling, who helped her to gather the folklore. And she's very open about that. She doesn't try to hide the fact that Mary Colling, this servant, has had a role to play. And there are many people that have used people of a lower class and not acknowledged their role, but she really champions Mary Colling in her work, and explains that Mary is the one that has gained the trust of the peasantry, as they're called, or the lower class, the lower order, she terms them, and listens to their long stories and writes these things down. And you hear those voices in the work, her work, because it was published, her first kind of non-fiction work on landscape and traditions was published in 1836, and it's got a very long title, but it's called A Description of the Part of Devonshire Bordering on the Tamar and the Tavy, and then the title goes on. But so yeah, it's the first book to really show us that method of collection. So that's really quite innovative and special about the work, I think.
And how did you first come across her work? Was it something that you'd always been aware of from sort of being around the Tavistock area? Is she kind of talked about quite a lot and her work quite well known? Is that how you encountered it?
Yeah, as someone that's lived in Tavistock for a long time, I'm familiar with her as being an important local person who's written about Tavistock, and once I got more involved with writing about landscape and the historic community, I regularly go to her work because she wrote in such detail about Tavistock that she's a great source for checking all sorts of things. You think, well, if I'm going for a walk and I want to write about a place, she is one of the people you would look at to say, well, what is she describing? Because it's great because her book was written in 1836, so it's before the railways came, it's before a lot of the Victorian development, so you're getting a bit of a snapshot before lots of things changed, so that's quite useful, as well as all the other folklore and tradition and social observation that is in her work. So yeah, I'm familiar with her as a local Tavistock author, and yeah, one of the most useful historical writers about Tavistock. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that fascinates me is that this is quite, which we've kind of already touched upon, this is quite early on, because I'm so used to kind of spouting the likes of Baring Gould or William Bottrell or Robert Hunt and people like that, and they're writing, a few decades later when you feel like there's a real like folklore becomes a huge thing. So this feels like frontier territory when it comes to this sort of work and delving into these sort of local stories, it makes you wonder what drew her to them, and you know, how that interest was sparked, whether it was coming from a sort of an interest in this sort of, because am I right in thinking that she came from a background in sort of fiction originally, whether it was a sort of interest in the storytelling aspects?
Yeah, so her first works were fiction, and but she specialized. I mean, I haven't read any of her fiction. Her fiction doesn't get read today, but what she did with her fiction, she drew on local traditions and she wove them into stories. So she clearly was interested in local tradition, but she just used it in a different way. And then what was influential as well, so the other spark is her relationship with the poet laureate Robert Southey. And Robert Southey isn't as well known today, but he was one of the three Lakeland poets alongside Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. So, you know, as a Lakeland poet and the poet laureate, this is a very notable literary man, and he ends up in a pen friendship with Anna Eliza Bray, because he writes to her after she's published a memoir of her first husband who died tragically young, and it's Southey's influence, and I see it also as permission to write about this. So as I say, clearly she's interested in it because she's weaving it into her fiction, but Southey, he says to her, and I said this in the talk at Port Eliot, but I think it's a really important quote. Southey says to her, "If you would stoop from fancy's realms to truth, I should like to see from you what English literature yet wants, a good specimen of local history, not the antiquities only, not the nautical history, nor both together, nor statistics, but everything about a parish that can be made interesting, all of its history, traditions, and manners that can be saved from oblivion." So that's really key. That is opening the gates to her, saying, you know, stop writing fiction, go to non-fiction, the realms of truth, he's saying, and you know, and save this stuff from oblivion. So there's clearly an awareness that these folk beliefs are worthy of being recorded, and having the poet laureate kind of give you permission to go to this territory where no one is yet really going is really important, really. And I think it's really significant that when she publishes her book, it is done so in the format of letters to the poet laureate. So he is very much present in the book as the person that she's writing to. And I think that helps to give a legitimacy to the subject matter, because at the time, folklore or peasant traditions, oral histories were very much still denigrated. They had been denigrated for several hundred years. They weren't seen worthy of recording, and where they were talked of pejoratively. So, for example, there was just as an example, there was a history of Cornwall from the earliest records and traditions to the present time by a man called Fortescue Hitchens, who published in 1824. And he does briefly mention pixie belief, but he does it under the heading "Ridiculous Superstitions Formerly Existing Among the Cornish Peasantry." So we can see from the way it's packaged that writing about folklore as worthy of attention was really not in vogue at the time. So to break that mold was a brave thing to do. And I think as well, maybe a brave thing to do as a woman writer as well, because you've got to remember, you know, they were not well regarded. I mean, there's another local writer of a few decades before Bray called Polwheel. Are you familiar with Polwheel? And he was notoriously strident in his views about women, and he published a letter, a very long poem it was, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's quite famous because it was talking about lots of the other women writers, and it was a riposte to Mary Wollstonecraft's writing about women's rights. So this is the world she's writing in. So to talk about folklore and be a woman writer talking about folklore is difficult territory. She could easily have damaged her reputation as a writer and ended up being very dismissed. So yeah, her relationship with the poet laureate is really significant.
And what I love about that little passage from Southey is basically it's a letter of encouragement, isn't it? And I like the fact that it's encouraging this pushing boundaries, in that I've read, Hitchens and Drew, and that from, I think it's about 1824. And it really only follows in the vein of similar things I've read from back in the 18th century, where it's someone going on a ramble around a county and noting points of interest.
Yes.
And things to do with maybe science and nature, but they don't really take the time to, you don't get the sense they're chatting to the locals. They're not interested in finding out the local stories, but Southey's encouraging this, is the way I read it anyway.
Definitely. And there's a lot of plagiarism that goes on as well, isn't there? I don't know if you've noticed that when you've read some of these people, that there's a lot of regurgitation of what other people are saying. And it's not particularly pushing the bounds into new territory often. Whereas her book, her description of the part of Devonshire bordering the Tamar and Tavy, really does go into new territory. It hadn't been done at that point.
I'd love to delve into some pixie stuff, because I think something that really stood out to me and something that really fascinated me when you were giving your talk the other week is so often I come across references by people like Robert Hunt, who makes this really interesting point about, and he's writing in, I guess, the 1860s, and he's trying to distinguish between Pisky law, if you like, in Cornwall, and the differences, across the Tamar. What I found really fascinating from hearing your talk, drawing upon Bray's work, is it's not as clear cut as that at all. And there's a lot of similarities that I found in some of the stories and some of the local traditions. And I think that to me is particularly interesting, because it makes you wonder why. I mean, Hunt must have been, I'm sure, was aware of Bray's writings. It's interesting that he kind of makes this point about, oh no, there's this definite difference and definite Pisky word, and it's different to Pixie. And I wanted to get your thoughts, but also how that fits in with what Bray tells us, because I don't think it's as clear as that. And I think I'm inclined to disagree with Hunt, if I'm honest.
Yeah. So when was Hunt writing?
In about, he starts writing in 1865.
Okay. I'm not a folklorist, so I don't know, some of the wider context, but I do know that in the folklore, that the way she's using the words of local people, pixies here, she flows between different spellings of pixie, but when she's making it clear what the local people are calling them, they call them pisgies. So we have that, that it's seen that pisky is Cornish and pixie is Devon, but she's saying that the local people in the Tavistock and the Dartmoor area call them pisgies, but she spells it with a G rather than a K. But you've still got that swapping over of the sounds. So this idea that this that it's Pisky in Cornwall and Pixie in Devon, I'm not so sure that is as clear cut.
I think there's something in the nature of these piskies, pixies. It becomes a minefield when you're trying to say it now. But Hunt kind of talks about there being differences within the character, but I'm not sure I agree as well, having read Bray's work a little bit more, because he's trying to present this idea that the piskies, if you like, in Cornwall have this darker shade to their character than the sort of the pixies in the Tamar Valley, who are kind of living it up in, he writes, living it up in lush green countryside. But we get things in stories from Bray that are equally dark, about sort of their mischievous nature, but also I found it fascinating that we get references to kind of almost the idea of changelings and things
Yes.
like that we get a lot in West Cornwall, but it feels like in some of Bray's stories, she talks about the idea of there being this pixie king and that some pixies are sent out and some of them they're kind of given different roles and jobs, aren't they? And some of them, do certain things, and some of them are the really sort of dark and mischievous ones that substitute human children. So I find that really interesting.
Yes, and she does talk about that. She talks about them being sent out on by their elven king, but then none of the stories she tells then feature an elven king. But she definitely talks about changelings, and yeah, here we go. Yeah, so she does talk about changelings, and there's a story she tells. She says the wicked and thievish elves, who are all said to be squint-eyed and are dispatched on dreadful errand of changing children in the cradle. In such cases, the pixies use the stolen child just as their mortal mother may happen to use the changeling dropped in its stead. I have been assured that mothers who credited these idle tales have been sometimes known to pin their children to their sides in order to secure them, though even this precaution has proved in vain. And she goes on to talk about this. So, yeah, there's clear belief of real malevolence going on there, and some of her other tales as well are, then they aren't pretty and nice. I
Mm.
mean, I think when she goes on to write a book called A Peep at the Pixies, where she does create a number of fictional tales for children, which are her own fictional creations, and those are much more light-hearted. And so when we think about Bray's writing about pixies, we might think of it as being a bit more child-friendly, but those were fictional stories aimed at children. This earlier work, where she was collecting genuine folklore, is definitely a lot darker. So there's a really nice story. Did you come across the one with the lady with the pixie ointment and the eyes?
Yeah, that really intrigued me, that one.
Yeah. Shall I kind of read some of that out for your
Yeah,
listeners
definitely.
to,
Yeah.
hear? So once upon a time there was in this town an old dame, and the dame passed her days in the useful capacity of a nurse, even though she aged, and was still useful in her generation by helping others into it. So she's a midwife. One night, about 12 o'clock in the morning, the dame had just got comfortably into bed when rap, rap, rap came on her cottage door with such bold, loud, and continued noise that there was a sound of authority in every individual knock. Startled and alarmed, she rose and learnt that the hasty summons was to bid her to attend a patient. The summoner appeared to be a strange, squint-eyed, little ugly old fellow. Not at all inclined in favour of the errand by the look of the messenger, she nevertheless could not or dared not resist the command to follow him and attend his wife. Heaven forgive me, but as sure as I live, I be going to the birth of a little devil, thought the dame. A large coal-black horse with eyes like balls of fire stood at the door. The ill-looking old fellow whisked her up, seated himself before her, and off they rode as if sailing through the air rather than trotting on the ground. It was a great relief when she found herself set down at the door of the neat cottage and saw a couple of tidy children and her patient to be a decent-looking woman who was soon delivered of a fine bouncing babe. The baby seemed very bold on its entry into life, for it gave the good old dame a box on the ear, as she declared the sweet little thing to be very like its father. The mother said nothing, but gave the nurse an ointment with the directions that she should strike the child's eyes with it. And then Bray explains that in the local vernacular, to strike was to rub or to soothe. So the nurse performed her task, though she thought it an odd one and wondered what it could be for. So she thought, as no doubt it was a good thing, that she might as well try it on her own eyes. And so she applied it to one eye by way of a trial, when, oh, ye powers of fairyland, what a change there was. The neat but homely cottage and all who were in it suddenly underwent a mighty transformation, some for the better, some for the worse. The new mother appeared as a beautiful lady attired in white. The babe was seen wrapped in swaddling clothes of a silvery gauze, looking prettier than before, but still with an elfish cast in its eye, whilst the other children had undergone an uncouth metamorphosis. For there sat on either side of the bed's head a couple of little flat-nosed imps, who with many a grimace and grin were busied to no end in pulling at the lady fairy's ears with their long hairy paws. The dame beheld all this without saying a word of her use of the magic ointment, and the sour-looking old fellow once more handed her up onto the coal-black horse and sent her home in quick dispatch. On the next market day, when she went to sell her eggs, who should she see but the same wicked-looking old fellow busied like a rogue, pilfering articles from stall to stall. Oh ho, thought the dame, have I caught you, you old thief? But I'll let you see I could set the mayor and town constables on your back if I chose to tell. So she went up to him boldly and addressed the rogue as a superior, inquiring carelessly after his wife and child. What? Exclaimed the old pixie thief. Do you see me today? See you? To be sure I do, as plain as I see the sun in the skies. I see you are busy into the bargain. Do you so? Cried he. Pray, with which eye do you see all this? With the right eye, to be sure. The ointment, exclaimed the old fellow. Take that for meddling with what did not belong to you. You shall see me no more. And he struck her eye, and from that hour till the day of her death, she was blind on the right side, thus dearly paying for having gratified an idle curiosity in the house of a pixie. So yeah, not so nice and cuddly, these pixies.
Yeah, I love it. And I think instantly I recognized it because there's an almost identical story from Paul Perrault
Okay.
that Jonathan Couch relates that was known locally as The Midwife's Tale.
Oh, okay.
There's a writer, she was called Barbara Spooner, and she was writing mainly about sort of East Cornwall things in the sort of mid 20th century and things like that. But she kind of speculated that the story might have a really early origins, maybe even as far back as the medieval period. But this story of like the idea of the Pisky sight, that some people can see them, but they don't like to be seen unless they wish it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's something that crops up in Bray's work a bit as well. This idea that they kind of like to show themselves, but they don't like being discovered, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's right. And there's so kind of related to that, there's a story she tells of the ungrateful pixie, because in this story, the when the pixie is like definitely acknowledged by the person in the house, then the pixie runs away.
This story about an ungrateful pixie reads as follows, and I quote, I have heard a story about an old woman in this town who suspected she received assistance of the above nature, and one evening, coming suddenly into the room, she spied a ragged little creature who jumped out at the door. She thought she would try still further to win the services of her elven friend, and so bought some smart new clothes, as big as those made for a doll. These pretty things she placed by the side of her wheel. The pixie returned and put them on, when, clapping her tiny hands in joy, she was heard to exclaim these lines, for pixies are poetical, they always talk in rhyme. Pixie fine, pixie gay, pixie now will run away. And off she went, but the ungrateful little creature never spun for the poor old woman after.
Again, I find that fascinating because that little rhyme crops up quite often in stories as well. That sort of pisky fine, pisky gay, pisky now will either run or fly away. So it makes you go, this was obviously part of storytelling traditions that came from all over this region, not just, they're not isolated to one specific place, but it makes you wonder that at some point, someone was traveling around telling them.
Yes. And, certainly with the mining, we had huge influx of miners. I mean, we have a mining tradition in this part of the world as well, but with the mines expanding greatly in the early 19th century, there's lots of records of Cornish miners being in the West Devon landscape as well. So there's mixing and movement of the population, 19th and 18th century movement from different parishes and across Devon and Cornwall. So yeah, these stories are much more fluid than I think we might credit from our modern perspective.
And I think that's important, and I think it's people just naturally migrate and travel for work and things, right? So I think they naturally then they take their local stories with them, and then wherever they go to, maybe some elements of that story gets absorbed into a similar local story, and it kind of evolves and develops like that.
There's a particular pixie story that I as a landscape writer am really interested in, and I think one that has maybe needs more credit for its importance, not because of the elaboration of the story, but its significance as maybe one of the earliest kind of datable pixie legends that there is, and that's this Fitzwell on Dartmoor. The Fitzwell on Dartmoor is a little kind of granite housing over a spring, and it's got the initials of John Fitz, who lived in Tavistock at Fitzford, and the date on it is 1568. And Bray is again, as far as I'm aware, the first one to put in print this story, this legend, which was that John Fitz and his wife Mary were riding on Dartmoor, and they were pixie led. And she says that after long wandering in vain effort to find the right path, they felt so fatigued and thirsty that it was with extreme delight they discovered a spring of water whose powers seemed to be miraculous. For no sooner had they satisfied their thirst than they were enabled to find their way through the moor towards home with the least difficulty. And then, in gratitude for the deliverance, John Fitz erects this stone memorial bearing his initials and the date over the spring for the advantage of all pixie-led travellers. So the story isn't, it's not a hugely elaborated story, but I think it's really significant because this spring that's well housing, today when you're at the Fitzwell, it's in a very reedy, wet field with granite walls, which is part of the prison estate. But back in 1568, of course, there is no prison, there are no stone walls. Those things were several centuries in the future. There was no Princetown nearby. There was nothing. There was no settlement at Princetown. So this well really was in the middle of nowhere and not even on the trackway. So there wasn't even a proper road across Dartmoor. The Turnpike Road was started in 1777. So there was just an informal trackway across the moor. So to put a well in this place where there was no cultural landscape really at all is a very odd thing to do. If we think about where you have wells today, they are near to settlements where people will make use of the spring water or their holy wells. But this is not a holy well, and it's not on a trackway, and it's not near a settlement. So to me, it does feel that there might be something's gone on for him to erect a well there in the middle of nowhere. So to me, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a pixie legend, but it kind of suggests to me that there might be some truth in this, because I'm finding it hard to think of other reasons why you might erect a well in what is an utterly saturated landscape. This is in a really reedy area. There's streams, there's springs everywhere. There's water erupting from the ground all over the place in that landscape. So it's not as if it's a spring because there's no other sources of water. So it feels landscape wise that there's something's gone on for Fitz at that point, which is why he wants to erect a memorial. So I think it differs from all the other pixie, traditions that I've seen, where you can really pin it down to real people and a real date. And so I haven't found a pixie legend where that's so old that you can date it. So I think that makes that one really interesting and a little bit different.
Definitely. And I'm fascinated that, as you say, it's so rare to find something that early on that makes a reference to this idea of being pixie-led or pisky-led, whatever you want to refer to it. It tells us it hints that there was that belief and that understanding. That sort of terminology has been around for at least that length of time. Yeah, I'm intrigued because I'm guessing that going hand in hand with that around Dartmoor, there's probably, with this idea of becoming pixie-led, I'm guessing there are there's probably lots of stories around this idea of getting lost on the moor, and that kind of fitting in with this idea of becoming pixie-led.
Yeah, so being pixie-led is a really common trope, isn't it, in pixie pixie tales, pixie oral tradition, and so Bray talks of a number of stories of being pixie-led. So she talks about Whitchurch Down, which is very close to Tavistock, and it's kind of a buffer zone between Tavistock and the higher moor. And so she says of Whitchurch Down, she says this is very famous for the peril there incurred of being pixie-led, for there many an honest yeoman and stout farmer, so tough men who you wouldn't expect to be affected by silly little things. These are tough guys, but they get pixie-led, especially, she says, if he should happen to take a cup too much, is very apt to lose his way, and whenever he does so, he will declare and offer to take his Bible oath upon it, that as sure as ever he's alive to tell it, whilst his head was running round like a mill wheel, he heard with his own ears they bits of pisgies are laughing and attacking their hands. So she uses the word tacking, which I presume means clapping. All to see he led astray and never able to find the right road, though he had travelled it scores of times long ago at night and by day, as anybody might tell. So yeah, Whitchurch Down is a common place for being pixie-led, but she gives the analysis that it's drunkenness that might be behind some of this, which is often a common interpretation of pixies being used as an excuse for poor behavior. So it's really common to hear that being drunk is a reason for being pixie-led. And of course, drunkenness was very common back then, much more common than it is today, and places to have a drink were much more common as well, weren't they? So there were regular inns along roads, and even before licensed premises came along, farms were ale houses. People would brew their own ale for sale for people passing by. So many opportunities for having multiple drinks along your route way. So and Whitchurch Down was a gateway to Tavistock, but linking the local villages and the moor. So it was a place of passage between places. So I can well believe that pixies were used sometimes as an excuse for drunkenness, but she goes on to say something. She goes on to say something interesting as well, and I'd be interested to see if you've come across this, because she then says, and many good old folks relate the same thing, and how the pisgies delight to lead the aged a wandering about after dark. And I thought that was really interesting, seeing this this mention of the aged wandering around after dark, because we might think of people going astray and alcohol being blamed on it, but we know in our today as well, people that go astray, people with dementia go astray. And so I was really interested to see that pixies leading the aged who might go wandering, because of course they would have been experiencing the same social issues that we do. So yeah, have you come across, maybe a dementia link being invoked in some pixie legends?
You know what? I hadn't considered it, but it makes a lot of sense in a way. There's a story by there was a writer in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century called Ennis Tregarthen, um,
Yeah,
from Padstow, and she records there was a book called North Cornwall Fairies and Legends. I think I can't remember if it's in that book, but there's a retelling I found. There's a brilliant little company called Mazed Tales, based here in Cornwall, but they relate a story called the Piskie Who Rode in a Pocket. And it talks of an elderly woman who's making her way home through is it Minster Woods, which I think is up near Boscastle Way. And it's this idea of this she's making her way home, and this Piskie decides he's going to jump in her pocket for a ride. But this leads her to becoming mazed or Piskie led, if
yeah,
you like. And she gets lost
yeah,
in the woods
yeah,
until eventually, that the when he's had his fun and larks or whatever, when she discovers him by turning her pockets inside out, he
yeah.
jumps out and laughs and runs away, but she follows him to find her way back home. But
Okay.
I hadn't considered that link, but that makes a lot of sense in terms of one interpretation of it. But yeah, it's more often you come across instances where it's like a farmer or someone who's making their way home from, or a miner making their way home back from work at night. But
Yeah,
yeah, you do get the odd story of an elderly person making their way home.
yeah,
Yeah, it does make you wonder actually about people's
yeah,
explanations for where people go at night, for example.
yeah. Dementia, mental illness, drunkenness, and just a landscape which is much darker than we experience today. And much more easy to get lost. Any of us could get lost under those circumstances. So yeah, all sorts of, it's a bit of a nice catch-all for all sorts of reasons why we might get lost. But those links to social issues, I think, are really, really interesting. Yeah, Bray doesn't talk about it, but I know that there are pixie tales about people getting mazed in a field and just kind of wandering around and around in a field and unable to get out. So
Yeah.
that's kind of a bit different to getting lost on a, losing your way on a track, on a route way that's not very well defined, and getting lost, but which are more easy to explain than getting disorientated in a small enclosed field. So those kind of pixie legends are harder to unpick what might be behind what's happening there. Yeah, but Bray doesn't talk about any of those. She talks about pixie fields in relation to a woman growing tulips, but she doesn't talk about anyone getting lost in the small space of a field.
There's another topic that it kind of it's probably the sort of last one in terms of pixie stuff, but I find it an interesting one because it crops up a lot. Is the idea of dancing. It seems to be one that Bray's quite interested in as well. Is this sort of tradition of, and I wonder what your thoughts were in terms of Dartmoor and places. Is this tradition of ideas of places that the pixies or piskies are said to dance, like almost pixie rings or certain sites that are like they're designated like they're thought to be where they dance sort of thing.
Yeah, she does talk about them dancing, and there's one. She talks about a place, Down House near Tavistock. Now, unfortunately, there are two Down Houses near Tavistock, and she doesn't say which one it is, but she calls it the Pixie Ballroom. She says it's a pit, and she says that not very long ago was appropriated for their ballroom, and there in the depth of night the owl, who probably stood as watchman to the company, would hoot between whiles, and sounds such as never came from mortal voice or touch would float in the air, making marvelous sweet music, and to which the pixies would dance. And she says they would whirl round giddily and make the rings. She says the rings whereof the yew not bites. So that's those pixie rings where the green grass grows a bit longer. So So she's kind of saying that those are formed by pixies dancing in rings. So this idea of ring dancing. And she talks of, there's a story she gives of tulips and a pixie field where the pixies come and they love the tulips that this woman's growing, and they sing their babies to sleep underneath the tulips. And once lulled, they would dance in a neighboring field, making these pixie rings again. So she has a couple of stories related to pixies dancing, but none, I haven't seen any of her stories relating to pixies dancing up on the high moor. So this idea of pixies being in places of antiquities like the rings on Dartmoor, the stone circles, none of her legends relate to placing pixies in those places, which is interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's there's an idea that pixies might inhabit these antiquarian places, but I don't get any sense in what she's writing about pixies inhabiting stone circles or standing stones. There's no linking of those two things together in her writing. But pixies dancing and dancing in rings in fields, yes.
I like that story. It's a fairly short story, but that story about the old woman and the tulips, because what I think I like about it is you get this sense of a fairly close relationship with the pixie world, with this woman, that when she passes away, and obviously the tulips are gone, that the pixies aren't happy about the new owner kind of planting, I think it's parsley or something.
Parsley,
we don't want that parsley stuff.
No.
You know? But they kind of then are visiting the old woman's gravesite, and sort of wonderful flowers grow there. And so I like this idea that this bond that's kind of formed with the sort of the pixie world, if you like, and how close that could be potentially.
Yes. So this idea that the pixies seem to be able to be capable of really sweet, nice things, and yet really horrible things, and they live, they're close to us and yet they're distant. They seem to inhabit everywhere and be capable of all sorts of things, don't they? There's a great latitude to pixie stories, and that can sometimes get funneled down into very narrow tropes. But when you look back at the pixie folklore, there is, as I say, a great latitude there that I think we need to recognise.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/thepiskytrap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode.
Bray's been recognised for recording pixie tales, and so has become very associated with pixies. But it wasn't just pixie folklore she was able to collect and wrote about. There are a lot of other things in her work. So I wanted to recognise that she did more than write about pixies. And so there's some really interesting things in her work. She did a good job of recording local annual traditions and their the traditions associated with annual events. She mentions things that happen on Valentine's Day and Midsummer's Day. And she says of Good Friday, it was considered a great sin to wash your clothes on Good Friday. And that if you did wash your clothes on Good Friday, one would be washing away one of their family who will die before the year is out. So quite dark.
Yeah.
Do not wash your clothes on Good Friday. She talks about Shrove Tuesday and the feasting on pancakes, obviously like we do. But she says of it that the farmers considered it a great holiday. So the farmers were really into Pancake Day. But she also talks about a thing called Lent crocking, in which parties of young people would go about to the noted farmhouses and sing in order to obtain a crock, which she says was a cake. And this tradition seems to be very like trick-or-treating, but associated with Lent. So these groups of young people would sing a song at the farmhouse door, and then would be hoped to be invited into the house for a cake and a cup of cider, and a toast to their health. But if they weren't invited in, then the sport consisted of splattering the house door with stones. And then the young people would be chased and be brought back in as a prisoner and undergo the punishment of roasting the shoe. So they would have to take an old shoe, which was hung up before the fire, and the culprit was obliged to keep a constant whirl, roasting himself as well as the shoe, until a damsel took compassion on him and let him go. Yeah, so you've got this trick-or-treat tradition at Lent with this shoe roasting. It's bizarre. There's a tradition on Midsummer, which she says, according to her husband, that they think that it's a much older tradition. So on Midsummer's Eve, which is the feast of St. John the Baptist, to creep under the communion table 3 times at midnight in the church. And that was held to be a cure against fits. And she says that the present sexton, Mr. James Cole, has been applied in such cases to unlock the church door to allow people to do this. But there's another tradition she talks about on Midsummer, where if you look through the keyhole at midnight on Midsummer's Eve, so in the Tavistock Church, the main door is opposite another door. So she talks about looking through the keyhole, and if you see someone walking through the door in the opposite direction, then that person will die before the year is out. And so that tradition, when I was writing about the Lich Way, I was looking at literature that was writing about divination at churches and scrying the future. So that seems to be a tradition of Midsummer that links to that. This on the threshold of the church, so the keyhole is very significant, and doors are very significant, aren't they? These liminal places, and using the church or the entrance to the church, that maybe the church gate as well, to scry the future and who was going to die, is something I've come across elsewhere. So this tradition linked to Midsummer, looking through the keyhole. I don't think I'm going to go to the church keyhole that's on Midsummer at midnight and look through the keyhole. I think I'd find that a bit spooky.
Doesn't sound worth the risk.
No, I don't think so, because she tells a tale in which someone did that and they saw themselves walking through. Yeah, so that's a bit scary. The one that really stuck out for me was Garland Day, which I'd never come across. Have you heard of Garland Day?
No, I haven't, no.
So she says that, so this is the 29th of May. So
yes, yeah.
It's today. It's today.
Oh yeah,
wow.
No, I didn't realize it was called Garland Day, but I was literally reading that this morning.
Yeah.
It's basically Oak Apple Day, isn't it?
Yes. So she doesn't call it Oak Apple Day, but it is Oak Apple Day. And so it's the celebration of the restoration of the monarchy. It's the day King Charles II returned back to England. So what she says of this, She says the 29th of May is still a holiday much observed in our town, though I am told far less than it used to be some years back. A notion prevailed that on that day any person might cut oak boughs whenever he pleased, provided it was done before 6 o'clock, and the youths and maidens would rise with the light to prepare for their sports. These oak boughs were hung round doors and windows, and chaplets, which I understand is a wreath or garland worn on the head or a hat or a bonnet. So they would make those. And in the afternoon, there would be a mock battle, which was the Republican and the monarchical parties. And she says the royalist combatants were armed with kettles and buckets of water, and the Republicans would tear down the oak boughs from the doors and windows and were well drenched, whilst a good-humoured scuffle ensued. And if the young men succeeded in getting the boughs, then they used to tie them together and drag them through the town in victory. Everyone made merry and frolicked.
Bray gives us an example of one occasion when things went awry during one of these Garland Day celebrations. She writes, "However, during one of these frolics about 30 years ago, so around the turn of the 1800s, rather an unpleasant affair took place from the following circumstance. This vicinity was a great depot for French prisoners, and some of the officers lodged in the town. Opposite a house where one of them resided was erected a grand display of oak boughs and may bushes on the top of a long pole. Some mischievous individual persuaded the foreigner that it was a part of the sports for some person, as a good joke, to remove it, and persuaded Monsieur to perform the feat. He, thinking no harm, did so, when a stout old fellow, a true John Bull, who lived near, seeing this act committed by the Frenchman, considered it as a premeditated insult to the royal family of England, as the oak boughs were suspended in honour of the restoration to the crown. Fired with rage, he sallied forth, armed with a poker, and commenced so vigorous an assault on the poor foreigner that had not the more peaceably disposed interfered and made up matters, he would very likely have left the luckless offender scarcely a whole bone in his skin." So things taking a pretty violent turn there with this joke played on the poor French prisoner of war. Unfortunately, I imagine things did occasionally erupt like this, and it must have been pretty tense because the Napoleonic Wars would still have been raging at this time.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that this Garland Day was still being practiced in the 1830s, but it's utterly gone from memory here. Well, I should re-erect Garland Day in Tavistock. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask, how many. I'm always wondering at how many of these, because I'd go so far as to say it feels like we're in the midst of a sort of folk revival in recent years. So it makes you wonder. I know that I imagine it's probably been the same locally for yourself, that the idea of wassailing, or sort of Bray talks about the sort of saluting the apple tree and that kind of thing. That's become very popular, even within the past year or two.
Yeah.
Escalate quite a lot. Are you finding that some of these local traditions are starting to be revived in some forms?
I'm not aware of anything in Tavistock. I'm aware of people wassailing, but I'm not aware of some of the other traditions being resurrected. And Garland Day seems like a really rich tradition, but I can't see it being resurrected. I can't see groups of young boys wanting to decorate, make hoops of flowers. Maybe it's those of us who are kind of middle-aged or older that would probably be interested in doing that. But yeah, I could see if there's any interest in resurrecting Garland Day, maybe.
One that I find interesting is this idea of the witch and the hare, or the hag and the hare, as it's sometimes referred to. I find that quite an interesting story as well.
Yeah, so there's some with witches in, or hags, some with Satan, and hares feature a number of times. And I'm quite interested in hares because I I did some research around women dairying, because I was interested in women dairying on the moor and dairy maids moving with the cattle onto summering grounds, and I was interested in what their world would have been like. And so I looked into the folklore and traditions around dairying, and I know that hares and witches feature a lot in folklore around milk and milk products, and hares are supposed to steal the milk. So I was quite familiar with hares featuring in folklore, and they feature quite a lot in the folklore that Bray talks about. So there's one where she talks about an old witch who lived, she says, lived nearby, but it's not specified, so it's quite vague, some of where this folklore happens. It's just local. And it says she needed money, and so she turned into a hare and sent her grandson to tell a local huntsman that he'd seen one, for payment of a sixpence for conveying this information. And so the dogs were sent out to chase the hare, but the hare was never caught. And eventually suspicion arises, and a justice and a clergyman are consulted, and it was agreed to trap the witch and they were aided and abetted by a neighbour who alerted them when the witch and the boy left the house. And so the hunt began really quickly, not giving the old hag, who's in the form of a hare, much chance. But she manages to get back. Well, the boy alerts her and he says, "Run, Granny, run." And the hare escapes through a small hole in the cottage door. And she scampers up to her bedroom, and it's too narrow for the hounds to get through. And the justice and the parsman find the old woman upstairs, wounded and breathless, but she denies everything. And the huntsman suggests bring the hounds in to identify her, and she panics and begs for mercy. And it says that both boy and Granny were spared with a whipping. However, later the woman was tried for bewitching a girl into spitting pins. And the hare incident was then cited as evidence. And at that point, she pays the worst price, because she is burnt at the stake like a martyr, Bray says. So yes, this linking of hares and witches. And it's interesting, this idea of the girl spitting pins, because I had a little look at that, and apparently that's another common folklore trope, isn't it? You're probably familiar with. And so apparently pin and needle women appear regularly in stories. And I was looking at some work by a man called David Ermacora, who has written about embedded pins and migratory needles, a historical folklore perspective. So there's a lot of folklore around pins and needles. And he talks about women and mental health conditions such as delusion and self-harming as often being at the heart of these pin and needle stories. So so it might very well be that there was a woman who was self-harming with pins. And yeah, you can just see where some of these stories get their origins. So, which links us back to some of what we were saying earlier about, mental health and dementia with some of the pixie stories, where you see this kind of woven into the narratives might come from.
Pins are an interesting one as well, because the pins were sometimes used as a way of trying to identify a witch by there's this idea of witch marks on the body that were insensible to pain. So they might use it to try and test on the body to identify an alleged witch. And so pins were used as a way of trying to detect as well. But I find it really interesting, this idea, this sort of alleged witches transforming into hares seems to be a thing that's sort of a storytelling tradition, because I seem to remember finding a story from, I think, the Chagford area of like a witch called, I think, Old Mole or something like that. And it follows the same kind of story arc, if you like. I think someone tries to shoot her with a silver bullet or something. I seem to remember it having a happier ending, though. I think it was like she agrees not to be too witchy anymore, and the community are all right in the end or something. But I love that, again, you've probably got maybe these stories that are sort of someone's got a hare and witch story from one edge of Dartmoor, someone else has got someone from another village, and maybe you've got this crossing of ideas, and again, stories kind of evolve and develop over the centuries.
women turning into hares was reasonably common, I think, in folklore, and the stories of women turning into hares and then suckling the milk from the dairy cows is quite common. And there's some really lovely images from some Scandinavian churches of hares and devils stealing milk. So these hares were supposed to have been women or the like neighbors stealing your milk lot, turning into and stealing milk, turning into a hare. So yeah, this transmogrifying into a hare and with witchcraft goes really deep.
Another of the stories you kind of mentioned at one point was the idea of is it the hellhounds of is it Heathfield?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. It links the hare. So the hare features again in this, but it also has the hellhounds, which are another common folklore trope. Because you have the wished hounds on Dartmoor, which feature in a number of traditions. But there's a story she tells which has this element of Satan and these hellhounds and a hare in the same story, which is much less well known. And it relates to the Heathfield. So the Heathfield is an area north of Tavistock, which is very different today to how it would have been 200, 300 years ago. Because the Heathfield, it says it in its name, doesn't it? It was a heath back not so long ago. It was another wild wasteland, featureless, probably with unclear trackways. So that's the kind of landscape that this is happening in. She says, there was once an old woman who mistakenly got up at midnight thinking it morning. So maybe another old person who's wandering around, a bit confused. It says she set off across the Heathfield on her horse, panniers, cloak and all, on her way to market. The Heathfield was a large, gloomy and solitary waste to the north of Tavistock, where evil spirits delight and devils dance. Here she heard a cry of hounds and saw a hare rapidly making towards her. The hare leapt on top of the hedge. Liking hunting, she grabbed the hare and popped it into the panniers and rode on. She had not gone far when she was alarmed on perceiving in the midst of the dismal solitary waste, advancing at pace, a headless horse bearing a black and grim rider with horns sprouting from under a jockey cap and a cloven foot thrust in a stirrup. He was surrounded by a pack of hounds with flaring eyes and tails that whisked and shone like fire, as the air itself had a strong sulphurous scent. The poor old woman knew in a moment that the huntsmen and hounds were riding from the regions below. He civilly asked the old lady if she could point out which way the hare had flown. She thought it no harm to return the father of lies and answer in his own coin. So she boldly denied she'd seen the hare, and he rode on, not suspecting the cheat. When out of sight, the hare in the panniers began to move, and to her utter amazement, out arose a beautiful young lady, all in white, who addressed her preserver. She goes on to say that this woman had been kind of turned into a hare in the past by evil spirits, and this kindness shown by preserving her from the devil. She helps the old lady, and she says that her hens will lay 2 eggs instead of more plentiful milk all year round, and she says that you shall talk twice as much as you ever, and your husband stand no chance in any matter between you. So she's promising all these wonderful things to this woman. So yeah, the hellhounds and the hare. And I see in the Torbay today, in June 2024, a person writing as the storyteller talks of a similar tradition at Bovey Tracy, where a local farmer saved a hare from the devil and his hounds. And in that story, the hare turns into a young man who had been turned into a hare. So a very similar story from either side of Dartmoor, of saving the hare from the devil. So in that case, the hare's a good thing rather than a witch.
Yeah, I found that really striking, and I found that in the Heathfield one, what also stood out to me is there's this reference of like she'd been sort of condemned to be this hare and be pursued by this pack of wish hounds or hellhounds, almost like it reminded me a bit of the Lady Howard legend, in that she's, in some versions of the story, she's transformed into this dog each night and has to pluck a blade of grass. It's almost like this sort of
Yes.
Sisyphean task, but it's broken
Yes.
by the intervention of this woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
What, I guess, drew you to Bray's work, and what inspires you in terms of local folklore? What draws you to it?
I'm most interested in local folklore as a way of trying to understand how people viewed the landscapes that they were in. So we spoke about that story around the Heathfield, and it helps me understand how landscapes have changed as well, and how people experience those landscapes. So the Heathfield today, it's farmland, it's enclosed, but it would have had a different relationship to the people of Tavistock. So for me, the folklore is a way into understanding how they related to their local landscape. I'm more interested in that, in what I can mine from the folklore for understanding their relationships to place, as opposed to the narrative arc of the stories themselves. So that's what draws me into the folklore, because I don't believe myself in the folklore. I don't believe myself in pixies, but it's interesting to, when I'm walking, to be able to think about how they perceived the places they were walking in. So we spoke about the Fitz legend, and them being pixie led, and them commemorating the place with a well. But that fear of being pixie led, them dying a bad death on Dartmoor, it would have been very important to have a good death, to die with readiness and with a priest beside you, and for them it would have been utterly terrifying, dying on Dartmoor without a priest there, without being able to die that good death, with the belief that their souls would roam, because they were not having the death that they were supposed to be having, that was managed within the Christian tradition. So understanding that, and that relationship to landscape in those terms, is really important, and that's what I can get from looking at this folklore, because my experience of landscape today is not how they would have been experiencing it. So that's what I really get out of looking at this folklore, understanding that their way of viewing the world was different to mine, and in some ways the same. But that, for me, is what's really useful in the work of people like Bray, and it can take me back to those places, and just her descriptions of place around that folklore as well are really helpful for me. So there's a lot in there, I think. Even if you're not interested in folklore in itself, I think there's a lot in what's written that I find particularly useful.
That was my chat with Dr. Sharon Gedye. Thank you to Sharon for taking the time to chat, and I definitely recommend checking out her blog, A Walk in English Weather, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. That's it for this episode. If you have any questions or thoughts about Anna Bray's work, or the topics that we talked about, feel free to drop me an email at thepiskytrap@gmail.com, or drop me a line on social media, where you can find me as The Pisky Trap. We'll be back again very soon with another episode. In the meantime, take care, and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.